Okay, I'm sorry. I look a mess. I was outside for a little bit. It was so windy here. But, and I almost forgot to read chapter 10, but I did not. And I think chapter 10 is pretty long, so I may only read half of it, but no, I'll read the whole thing. It's the end of the books. This is the last chapter. Ruth Rose, what are you talking about? Dink didn't know what to think except that he was getting a huge headache. What makes you think I'm Wallace Wallace? Mavis asked. Ruth Rose walked over to Mavis. May I borrow your scarf? She said. Ruth Rose held the scarf up so everyone could see it. When I first saw the scarf, I thought that those little black letters were M's. M for Mavis. She looked at Mavis Green, but they're not M's, are they? She turned the scarf completely upside down. So if you have an M, if you have an M and you turn it completely upside down, what letter do you have? You have a W. What two names begin with W? Wallace Wallace. Booyah. They're little W's now. Right. W for Wallace Wallace. Ruth Rose pointed at the man. You just said you live in a little cottage, but Wallace Wallace lives in a big castle in Maine. It says so on the cover of The Silent Swamp. Ruth Rose pointed at Mavis's book bag. Seeing your bag again made me remember something I thought of today. Josh read that your castle was called Moose Manor. There's a picture of a moose on the side of your bag. Ruth Rose handed the scarf back to Mavis, and we read that Wallace Wallace's favorite color is green. You like green ice cream, and you chose Mavis Green for your fake name. Everyone was staring at Ruth Rose except for the man they had untied. He started laughing. The cat's out of the bag now, sis, he said. And then Mavis laughed and gave Ruth Rose a hug. Yes, Ruth Rose, Mavis said, I really am Wallace Wallace. She put her hand on the man's shoulder. And this is my brother, Walker Wallace. He's been planning my kidnapping for weeks. Dink stared at Mavis, or whoever she was. You mean Wallace Wallace is a woman? He said. Yes, Dink, I'm a woman, and I'm definitely Wallace Wallace, she winked. Honest? Mavis, the real Wallace Wallace, sat on the bed. She took off her glasses and pulled the barrettes out of her hair. She shook her hair until it puffed out in the mass of wild curls. Thank goodness I could be myself now. All day I've had to act like timid Mavis Green. I can't wait to get out of this fuddy-duddy dress and into my jeans again. She kicked off her shoes and wiggled her toes in the air. Boy, does that feel good. Dink blinked and shook his head. Mavis Green was really Wallace Wallace. He could not believe it. But why did you pretend to be kidnapped? He asked. The real Wallace Wallace grinned at the kids' surprised faces. I guess I owe you an explanation, she said. My new book is about a children's mystery writer who gets kidnapped. In my book, some children rescue the writer. I wanted to find out how real kids might solve a real mystery, she said. She smiled at Dink, and then your letter came inviting me to Greenlawn, and that's what gave me the idea to fake my own kidnapping. I'd become Mavis Green and just watch what happened. Oh yeah, Dink said. In your letter, you said you were doing some research in Connecticut. She nodded yes, and I mentioned the word kidnap in the letter to get you thinking along those lines. She smiled at the three kids. I thought I'd have to give you more clues, but you solved that mystery all by yourselves. Dink laughed. You recognized me in the bookstore from my picture, and you didn't send me a picture so I wouldn't recognize you. And then my nutty sister dragged me into her plan, Walker Wallace said. I should be home checking my lobster pots. While you were eating lunch, Walker and I ate ours up here. Then just before 2 o'clock, I tied him to the chair and ran downstairs to meet you out front as Mavis. Wallace Wallace threw back her head and laughed. Do you remember downstairs when Dink said there was something fishy on the third floor? She got up and stood next to her brother. Well, I'm always teasing Walker about smelling fishy from handling his lobster bait. So when you said something was fishy in the hotel, I had to pretend to cough so you wouldn't know that I was actually really laughing. Boy, did you have us fooled, Dink said. Wallace grinned. Mr. Paskey was in on it. I had to tell him the truth. As you saw this morning at the Book Nook, my little scheme made him very nervous. I've promised him I'll come back and do a real book signing soon, but I'll be in disguise, so be prepared for anything. Dink shook his head. I was so disappointed because I couldn't meet my favorite author this morning, and I've been with you all day and didn't even know it. She looked at Dink. I'm so sorry I tricked you. Will you please forgive me? Dink blushed. Well, sure, of course. I have a question, Josh said. Where did you really sleep last night? Right here in room 302. A few weeks ago, I telephoned to reserve 2 rooms next to each other. Last night, I checked into room 303 as Wallace, the man. Up in room 303, I took off the hat, the coat, and the sunglasses. Then I sneaked back down to the lobby wearing a blonde wig. I checked in again, but this time as room 302. Did you smudge the signature? Oh, you noticed that, Wallace said. I'm so used to signing my real name in books, I actually started to write Wallace. So I accidentally smudged it so you couldn't read the word. I have a question, Miss Wallace. What should we call you? My friends call me Wallace, she said. Well, the taxi driver told us you were smiling in the taxi. What were you smiling about? Wallace was smiling now. Oh, about a lot of things. First, I was wearing a man's disguise, and that made me feel pretty silly. And I knew I was going to meet you, one of my biggest fans, and I was happy because I knew whatever happened, the next day would be super fun. I sure had fun, Josh said, grinning. Poor Mr. Paskey, having to lie to everyone with a straight